Welcome back. In this video we continue our series with the Karpov game that we left at move 3. As I said in part 2 of the series, this and the following video will concentrate on calm positions, then in part 5 we'll start discussing wild positions which are filled with tactics and crazy complications. Now let's begin. Karpov actually went for one of our candidates, bishop takes f6. I think he chose this move because he wanted to create an imbalanced position where he can outplay his opponent with his superior understanding. We have pawn takes by brown. Then knight to c3, targeting the weak d5 square. Black plays bishop to g7, preparing castles. g3 by Karpov. Knight to c6, then Karpov played the bishop to g2, strengthening the bind on the d5 square. f5 by brown, activating the bishop and controlling the e4 square. e3 then castles. G-knight goes to e2, then brown plays pawn to a6. Rook to c1, breaking the bishop pin so that the knight can freely jump to d5 when it is ready. Pawn to b5, and Karpov keeps it simple by pawn to d3. Bishop to b7 and castles by white. d6, then queen to d2, connecting the rooks. Black also connects his rooks by queen to a5. We have rook f to d1. And white is finished with his development. Karpov is playing simple and principled chess. I don't think anyone can disagree with me on that. Then black plays the a-rook to b8, with the idea to open the file with pawn takes on c4 later. Now we have reached the position for this lesson, and we start using the algorithm. Question 1. Do I have a direct win? Let's answer. As we all know, we start with the forcing moves, which are the checks, captures, threats and pawn breaks. In this position there are no checks, so we move on to captures, and there's only one, pawn takes on b5. White is forced to capture back with pawn takes b5. The knight goes to the d5 weak square, and here black has two options, exchanging on d2 or keeping the queens on the board with queen to d8. Let's analyze both. We'll start with the capture. Queen takes d2, rook takes. Now the position is stable again without tension, so we can evaluate. The material on the board is even, the kings are equally safe. When the queens get traded off, most players tend to neglect the safety of the king, but as my student you must know that minor pieces are also attackers, and sometimes they outperform a queen. We now move on to piece activity, and here that's where we can see a difference. White's bishop on b7 has potential of being active, but at the moment its activity is restricted by the knight on c6. The bishop on g7 is active, although it's staring at an empty diagonal. The knight on c6 is reasonably active, but at some point it has to move so that the b7 bishop gets some activity. Now we look at white's minor pieces. The bishop on g2 is an amazing piece which supports the beautiful knight on the d5 outpost. The knight on e2 is also good as it is eyeing the f4 square. White's rooks are perfectly placed at the central files, while black's are staring at their own pieces and pawns. All that being said, I know you might be thinking that white already obtains a winning advantage, but that's not the case, as black's pieces are not statically bad. They are dynamically bad. We'll talk more about this in our evaluation lessons. White's pawn structure is better, but black has his two bishops. So all in all we should come up with an evaluation that white is slightly better due to the better placed pieces. Now, let's move on to the queen retreat to d8. Now we can see that the position is stable again, but nothing has changed much as compared to queen captures on d2, except for the fact that the queens are still on the board. So the evaluation should be around the same. So we conclude that after pawn takes on b5 white is slightly better. Now we keep the move at the back of our minds as it did not produce a negative evaluation. As we are done with the captures, we now move on to the threats, and in this particular position it's clear that white cannot pose any. So we calculate and evaluate pawn breaks, and in this position there are two, pawn to d4 and pawn to 4. Let's start with pawn to d4. We have pawn takes on c4, pawn takes. Now we evaluate. The material is even. Both kings are reasonably safe, and both sides' pieces are almost equally active except maybe for the c6 knight and b7 bishop, which are restricting each other. White's structure is healthier than black's, but as I said, this is compensated by the bishop pair. All in all, I think white has a slight edge. Now we must do comparison, a topic I'll talk about when I'm teaching you how to calculate properly. If we compare the two moves, we should be able to find out which one's better. In order to save time, I'll just mention that the two moves are almost the same in terms of evaluation, so to choose which one gets eliminated is just a matter of preference. So I'll eliminate pawn to d4 as the ending position gives white an unstable center, which I'm not comfortable to play with, to be honest. So we keep pawn takes on b5 at the back of our minds for later comparison and elimination. Pawn to a4 is our next pawn break. We have pawn takes, then rook to a1 pinning the pawn. Knight to e5, rook takes pawn, queen b6, queen a2, knight f3 check, king to h1 on bishop takes on f3, black has bishop takes, rook takes on a6, queen takes on b3, and black has the bishop pair and is dominating white's light squares. So black is better here, and we immediately discard bishop takes on f3. Now let's get back to our position. We have h5 by black, trying to use the g3 pawn as a hook to open up white's king's position. You'll learn about hooks when I start teaching about positional play. h4 by white, and we start to evaluate. The material is even, the kings are equally safe, although black's king has more pawn cover. The pieces are almost equally active, although black's pieces are pressuring white's b3 pawn. White has a better structure, but black has the bishops for that, and also he has pressure on the b-pawn. The position should be evaluated as roughly equal, but I'll take black any time of the day. So we eliminate pawn to e4 as pawn takes on b5 is a better move. Now we're done with forcing, and none of the moves gives a winning advantage, so we move on to the next question. Does my opponent have any threats? And in this particular position the answer is no. But after our next lesson we'll deal with such positions, and I'll show you how to deal with them, and how you spot them, especially tactical and direct ones. Now we must create a plan, and in this particular position two moves catch my eye. The first one is knight to d5, going for that weak square, and the second one is pawn to h4, going for h5, trying to use the g6 pawn as a hook. I think we can immediately evaluate the moves, as there isn't any crazy move that black can play. Let's start with h4. Black can try pawn takes c4, but after pawn takes it becomes clear that the backward pawn on d6 will be black's downfall. Now let's evaluate the position after h4. The material is balanced, the kings are both reasonably safe, but the pawn structure and beautiful activity and placement of all of white's pieces gives white a small but clear advantage. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we compare h4 and the move we stored at the back of our minds. Pawn takes on b5. If you have already forgotten, then we eliminate the worse. I think we should eliminate pawn takes on b5 and keep h4. I'll explain in detail in our comparison and elimination lessons. Now that we're once again left with one move, we stored it and move on to the next candidate. Knight to d5 is the move that Karpov went for, but it's hard to choose between knight to d5 and pawn to h4. Brown played queen captures on d2, rook takes and b4. This is where we'll leave the game and we'll conclude it in our next lesson. Thanks for watching. Subscribe if the video was helpful, and don't be shy to ask me whatever chess-related question on the comment section. See you on our next lesson.